when she goes on this high.
Yep. Why is it not connecting to the proper interface? Hold on a second.
And this has been all day. It's been a fun conversation too. So we've got this.
Just plug that back in and see if it makes its connection.
What did we do before?
What did we do? I know.
We stopped along and paid
How would I have
for
known
a
about
telephone
Jack Kemp?
call.
What would I have to do? Find some Encyclopedia Britannica in some library to find out about Jack Kemp?
Why in the world did this not want my, does this not like my? Come on. I'll unplug that and then let's plug it back in. And now let's tell it again what it needs to be. We're going to audio input and we're doing connect. And it says, please wait. So I'm waiting. I put that back down.
8
And
hours
there it
have
is.
come.
It's there.
Okay. When in doubt, plug it in again. What? Why is this not showing up? Let me check and see if I can Are we there, Penelope? You can. Okay, well, I think it's saying that it's got a proper volume now. So we're going to go ahead and go for that. All right, bye. Text support in the form of my wife.
Yes, wonderful.
Well, I knew if she was calling while the class was on, because she does watch from home. I knew if she was calling, there was a problem. So, all right. Thank God for good wives. I think I was just asking whether or not people, when they were expecting, or new people who, when they were expecting, had a preference for their child.
When I came home with my 4th child, which was a girl,
Mm-hmm.
I was met in the driveway with a very morose little boy who said to me, "Mom, I never thought you would do that to me." He did not need 3 sisters. He wanted a brother. So there are some people who have very strong preferences, but they don't always.
So siblings often have very strong preferences. I see, yes. And definitely, I have been in a similar situation where a sibling had a strong preference about what the next child should be. But no one else seems to be throwing up their hands saying, we definitely wanted it to be a boy, or we definitely wanted it to be a girl. We just want it to be healthy. That's what everybody says now. It's not as though the whole, boy and girl thing is a competition much anymore. We say, if it's a girl and healthy, we're happy. If it's a boy and healthy, we're happy. And if we have 15 girls, why not? And if we have 15 boys, God help us, why not? So does that mean there's no difference? There's no boys aren't better than girls aren't better than boys? We're just.
Well, the boy carries on the family name.
So for many families, there is definitely still a preference to have at least a boy somewhere in the mix in order that the family name might be preserved or carried on or passed to the next generation. But even that has become a bit less of an issue because many girls are keeping their family name, the one that they were born with, and in many cases even are willing to pass that on to their children or hyphenate for their children's name. So within another 10, 15, 20 years, that may no longer be in the advantage column for boys. So when we look at the Torah, does the Torah seem to have a preference for boys or girls?
Yes.
Yes, which?
Boys.
Boys? Why do we say the Torah prefers boys?
Because they inherit everything.
Because they inherit everything. Yeah. So does that mean the Torah prefers them or just that is what happens? So there's an important intellectual step whenever we're reading something in the Torah, or anything for that matter, but for the Torah in particular, because we are trying to understand what God has given us, to make a distinction between the Torah describing what is and the Torah describing what is good or bad. And that's an important distinction, because oftentimes the Torah will be describing what is, in case of inheritance in particular, which happened to be focused around the economic structure of the ancient world, which was entirely agrarian and land-based. And because of the Torah's tribal system, which was based upon patrilineal descent because of the 12 sons, simply is saying this is the way land is divided, and therefore that is the way land is divided. And saying it's good that that's the way the land is divided. And the Torah never actually claims it's good that's the way the land is divided. It simply says that is the way the land is divided, and in fact makes exceptions to try and mitigate the circumstances and its impact on women. And indeed, the rabbis do in many cases. If everyone thought this was simply the best and everything was fine, you wouldn't have the daughters of Zelophehad going to Moses and being backed up by God and saying, yes, they're absolutely right in their complaint. And you wouldn't have the numerous instances, most notably the ketubah, instituted by the rabbis in order to further protect women from this system of inheritance. So that it is doesn't mean that it is the good, capital T, capital G. And that's going to be something important to wrestle with and to see how others have wrestled with it in today's double parasha of Tazria-Metzora. And we're going to be looking at the Tazria part of the double parasha. So we're going to be right up at the start, page 649.
Wow. And it's not any kind of judgmental thing that the Torah will tell us the names of the boys and the men, but the names of the women are frequently left out. And that's, you're saying it's a cultural thing at that time, since it wasn't as important in terms of inheritance.
I would actually say more of it's a narrative thing. That as any author will tell you, when you're telling a story, giving the list of every person who lives in the town is not going to help the story. It's not going to help the narrative. In fact, it will dilute the focus of the reader. So you tell the names as they are needed for the telling of the story, of what happens next. And for much of the story, who the boys were, so to speak, was more critical to what happened next than who the girls were. But where the girls were critical, they were named just as well. Which is why we get Sarah and Rebecca, and why we get Rachel and Leah, why we hear about Dinah because of what happens to her and its impact, why we hear about many girls like the daughters of Zelophehad that are also critical to the narrative, and why we also don't hear about the other thousands of men who are not critical to the story. Remember that there may be fewer female names mentioned in the narratives than male names, but there are also almost as many male names not mentioned as there are female names, right? Because if you get 1% of the men named and you get maybe 0.25% of the women named, the total number of non-named women and men is both more than 99%. It's just you get a slight disparity in the number of the actual named.
True, and not that I want to be argumentative. On the other hand,
Go ahead.
We don't know the name of Noah's wife.
Correct.
We don't know if Adam and Eve had any girls, although they must have. And so those are sort of left out. But I could see what you're saying. It's not that necessary.
And when we say they are left out because they weren't essential for the moving of the plot,
right.
It's important to then review what we think the plot is. Because oftentimes we may think the plot of Adam and Eve is the population of the world. And therefore, the names of daughters would be essential.
Yes.
The fact that they're not there may tell us that the story of Adam and Eve is telling us something very different than populating the world.
Rabbi, obviously I come to this topic with my male sensibility. But having said that, I've always been struck by the parsha in Genesis when God says to Abraham, listen to Sarah.
Yeah.
I've always felt that was a major statement.
Absolutely.
In terms of the two genders.
True.
Absolutely. And in fact, throughout the narrative of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebecca and Jacob and Rachel and Leah, the women are very often in control of the narrative. They may not be the formal head of household in the public sense, as would have been unusual in those days, but they are instrumental in steering the direction of the plot. And in fact, you'll see time and time again that it is the woman who decides the path of the covenant in terms of who will inherit next, much more so than the man does. So yes, it's important to pay attention to these little details and to distinguish between what is and what is receiving divine approval, which is going to bring us to the interesting split in chapter 12 here.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people thus. When a woman at childbirth bears a male, she shall be impure 7 days. She shall be impure as at the time of her menstrual infirmity. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until her period of purification is completed."
All right, let's make sure we understand this before we hit the next verse and start looking at some contrasts. So for 7 days, what's her status?
Impure.
Impure, right? Well, impure, unclean. But we're going to use the generic masculine version just because it's easier than trying to go back and forth in the gender. She is tameh, right? Tama in the feminine version, but tameh is easier to use, right? She is ritually impure. Now, ritually impure comes with 2 consequences in this particular case. One of them, most obvious as being mentioned here.
She can't enter the sanctuary.
Okay, so one thing is that she is prohibited from holy stuff, meaning she can't go into the Mishkan, she can't do the sacrifices. If she was a daughter of a Kohen and in his household, she would not be able to eat from the sanctified offerings or the gifts that were given to the Kohanim as well. That needed to be in a state of sanctification to eat. So one thing is that holy things are off limits. And what else is off limits? Her husband. No intimacy, if you like, between her and her husband. Right? So for the 7 days immediately following the birth of a child, she can't do any of the sacrificial or other sanctified activities that were connected with the Mishkan, with the tabernacle, and then later the temple. Those are only temple level sanctifications. She would still be allowed to participate in the normal Jewish activities that happen outside of the precincts of the temple or tabernacle. And the intimacy between her and her husband would be in abeyance. No fun between them, if you like, for a euphemism.
That's actually very kind.
Kind to
The woman.
To the woman? You mean now that you've just given birth, maybe
Yeah.
the last thing on your mind is
That's right.
the lingerie?
Exactly.
And we'll come back to that question in just a second. Okay, so for 7 days, both of these are off limits. And this is where we get to some rabbinic interpretation because it's a little unclear from the text itself. What's the next 33 days mean? So she's got this 7-day period. They do the Brit Milah on the 8th day, as we've already known from the story of Abraham. And then she's got these 33 days. Okay, so exactly as the blank stares are looking at me from the table is the problem, and why we thank God for our sages of blessed memory, Chazal, for giving us the tradition of understanding what this means. What they say is that for 33 days, she continues to be prohibited from the holy things, but husband time is now okay, even if there still continues to be signs of blood. Right? Normally, in the process of an average life, an average month, an average day in the life of a woman, if there is a sign of blood, that means that between her and her husband there has to be cessation of intimacy. Right? We're all following the delicate usage of terminology here. Right? This is what we generally call nida. Right? And this happens for most women every month. That there would be, if she's not pregnant, there would be a normal menses process, and her husband would separate during that period. If there was blood shown at another time, rather than just the regular monthly time, that is to say not on schedule, there would also be a separation. And that's where we would count 7 clean days from the end of that unusual showing of blood. During this 33 days, if she shows blood, it's not considered to be problematic. It's not considered to force reseparation between her and her husband. You following that? Okay. So that's what we're talking about. We got 7 days when for holy things and her husband, she's off limits. And for 33 days, holy things remain off limit and the husband is now okay. And at the end of this, by the way, she's going to have to bring a sacrifice, which is why knowing when this ends is so important, because then she definitely does need to be okay for the holy stuff. Okay.
If she bears a female, she shall be impure 2 weeks as during her menstruation, and she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 66 days.
Okay. Anyone want to do the math for me?
Double.
Double. Okay. All right. So we've got a total of 40 days over here, and we've got a total of 80 days over here. And obviously 7 and 14 is twice as long, and 33 and 66 is twice as long. So, which is better, a boy or a girl?
For whom?
For whom?
That's right.
You mean this doesn't tell you automatically that the Torah prefers boys over girls or girls over boys? Doesn't this mean God likes men?
It also means God likes women. He doesn't really, the poor man is being punished for 2 whole weeks now.
Because of the 2 weeks of
2
separation.
weeks of separation. She, on the other hand, gets a 2-week break when she's probably sore and uncomfortable. And
You're assuming that a cessation of intimacy is a relief to her.
at this particular
At that particular time.
circumstance, yes.
At the postpartum.
Postpartum. In fact, I think today many doctors will tell you a month.
Actually, I don't know off the top of my head. Does anyone know what the current recommendation is for a postpartum cessation of intimacy?
It's been a long time, Rabbi.
Well, that's
I can't
something
remember that far back.
we can ask Dr. Google later and
Okay.
find that out.
Right.
But you're right. I do believe that there are various recommendations. I don't know what the standard
Right.
practice is, but I do believe there are definite recommendations currently that there should still be a separation for intimacy. I think often it will depend upon the nature of
Yes.
the delivery. If there was any sort of rupture or other issues, then it would definitely be a longer period. If it was a cesarean, I know they definitely recommend a longer period because of the wound that has to be healed.
But they don't make a distinction between whether you have had a boy or a girl.
They do not. They do not. And maybe they're just bad doctors then.
Maybe.
Well, we're gonna get to that. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit on to verse 6 and finish up verse 12 here.
On the completion of her period of purification for either son or daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a purification offering. He shall offer it before the Lord and make expiation on her behalf. She shall then be pure from her flow of blood. Such are the rituals concerning her who bears a child, male or female. If, however, her means do not suffice for a sheep, she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a purification offering. The priest shall make expiation on her behalf, and she shall be pure.
Okay, so we got that. So that the sacrifice that comes after either 40 days or 80 days is either a lamb and a dove, or if you can't afford the lamb, just 2 birds would be fine. Right? We're talking dove, pigeon, turtle dove. It's kind of a generic species here. So double between the purification process. But what do we notice here between boys and girls?
Same.
Same. Repeated multiple times in our concluding verses of this chapter 12, that whether it's a boy or a girl that has been delivered, whether it's boy or girl that has been born, the sacrifice that is brought is identical. So, boys and girls, any better than the other? Is God approve more of one or the other? Is this somehow saying that girls are inherently bad and therefore, well, no, you don't have to bring a bigger sacrifice because you dared to birth a girl. It doesn't work out like that. And indeed, this has confused our commentators for a few thousand years. Because if we were to say, or if we were to think that the doubling is something to do with the inherent inadequacy or wrongness of a female birth, we would expect that to be reflected in the sacrificial system as well. Or if we thought that maybe it's double because it's better, we would still expect to see some reflection in the sacrificial system. But we don't. We see the distinction only during this purification process, having to do with the recuperation after delivery. and not in what takes place within the confines of the temple and or tabernacle at this time. So why? Why a distinction? And which one is the more natural? Is it that boys are half the time of girls, assuming then that the girl time is the normal weight? Or is it that girls are twice as long as boys, assuming that the boys is the normal weight? Right? Are girls 2x or are boys 1/2 x? Where x is the normal. 6 of one, half dozen of another? Well, let's see what our commentators have said. That's a very unequal distribution of the handouts. I don't want people to think that just because I'm handing one packet to a man and one packet to a girl, that I gave her twice as much as I gave him. Okay. All right. Harriet?
Okay. Everyone is supposed to enjoy themselves on the day of the Brit Milah. But until the mother immerses, she and her husband are forbidden to each other, which impedes their joy.
All right, so the Bechor Shor says that the reason why for boys it's 7 days is because we know what we're doing on the 8th. The 8th is going to be the Brit Milah, the circumcision. That is a day of joy. And in order to maximize the joy of the day, husband and wife need to be accessible. Now remember, the laws of Nida do extend more than just what happens in the bed. There are other forms of contact that are prohibited, other actions that are prohibited, and therefore removing that barrier before the Brit Milah day, before day 8, would definitely make things easier between husband and wife, not just because of intimacy. And so his opinion is that's why boys are at 7, because you have this 8th day deadline. Make sense? So then what would we say about the norm? Is X here or is X here? Which is not XY genetics. Which one is the normal? All right, is this 2X or is this 1/2 X? Which one is the standard? 14 or 7?
I would say 14, but they're having that because the boys' Brit Milah comes right in the middle of the standard, so you have to change the standard.
So I think Bechor Shor is absolutely with you on that, Harriet. He's saying the standard you would assume would be 14. But because of the pressure of the Brit Milah, we're cutting it short because we want to make sure that they can be together in every way that phrase means.
But it's a moot point. I mean, no woman 7 days after birth is going to be interested in.
But you can't even touch. You can't hug. There's a lot of other things forbidden as well.
Right. I mean,
Granted,
in general, but
you're talking
what?
about, as you were intimating,
Mhm.
then again, I think that's a moot point.
Right.
Touching would be nice.
Well, Bechor Shor definitely leans, I would think, in his commentary towards the notion that more may happen than just a hug. And it may be that a woman might not be interested, or even the man may not be interested that soon after a birth. But the fact that it is now possible may create a certain emotional situation as well. That when you are available, even if you're not, you're still feeling a closeness that isn't there when you're unavailable, if that makes sense at all. We'll come back to somewhat of that idea. But it does seem that he's implying that it's the 14 that's normative and it's being rushed because of the Brit Milah. Okay? On the other hand,
Just as the ordinary cycle lasts 1 lunar quarter.
Barbanel says, what is the standard measure? 7, right? Because that's a quarter of a moon. We all are aware here that the standard cycle for human females, it matches on average the standard cycle of the moon. Not necessarily that full moon equals anything on any particular woman, but the number of days is pretty close to being the same for the demographic average. I know your results may vary, but you don't. Well, actually, whether you want to or not, you're going to be. But the idea is that, according to a Barbanel, is that the moon takes 28 days to go through its phase, and there are nice, clear demarcations at the 7-day mark right? Where you go from no moon to half a moon, you go from half a moon to full moon, you go from full moon to down to half a moon, and then you go from half a moon to no moon again. It's very clear 7-day markers. What's that?
It's amazing.
And it is amazing. And he's using, and he's using it not as coincidental, but saying therefore 7 is the natural unit of division. And that means that 7 is here, and this is 2 times the unit of division. And therefore it is longer for girls. Not that it was rushed for boys, like the Chor argued, but that it was extended for girls on the other side. So we're good and confused, right? Because we didn't get any unanimity here. We still don't know whether it's 2x or half x. But we definitely are getting this idea that there still is this question of what is the difference between boys and girls that would make this be multiplied or divided in the first place. So we're now going to look at Sefer HaChinuch, which we've looked at before, and I've mentioned numerous times, and again, continue to encourage people to go out and get. You can get a free version easily online in Hebrew. If your Hebrew isn't quite there, you can also get a very reasonably priced for what it is, a set of 5 books that goes through the entire Torah, mitzvah by mitzvah, giving a nice standard explanation of every mitzvah that's in the Torah. So it's a wonderful resource to have and a great companion for studying with the weekly parasha. Even though many other traditional commentators disagree with some of his conclusions, it's a great summary and starting place for a discussion. So let's see what we can do. What's that? It's on the back. Sefer HaChinuch, right there. That's a point of contention and question. So there's a lot of debate among scholars of who the official author is. So well, there's lots of assumptions, but at the moment, officially, it is anonymous. Yeah. Kind of like Wikipedia, except this one has been peer checked even more rigorously.
Oh, so it's been authenticated.
Oh yes, this is definitely considered to be a reliable source for a standard definition of many of the mitzvot according to a common understanding of them. Which is to say, like every other thing in Judaism, there's debate, discussion, and disagreement. So this is not considered a law code, but it is a wonderful beginning for the average of what was being discussed at the time. But sometimes, like in our case, he goes beyond the actual halacha and tries to give explanation. And sometimes he's drawing from traditional sources, meaning from Mishnah, from Midrash, or from Talmud. And sometimes he's drawing from contemporary sources of his own during the Middle Ages.
It is a mitzvah to declare ritually unclean a woman who gives birth.
That's what the Torah said, right? We've already read that.
In other words, that a woman should be unclean to her husband, and all the more certainly in regard to matters of ritual purity.
Right, that's our holy versus husband distinction.
For 7 days when she bears a male child, and for 2 weeks when she gives birth to a female, as stated in Leviticus.
All right, so that's the statement of the mitzvah, right? Just restating it as it is. Now,
as to the root purpose of the precept, first a preface.
all right, before I begin, I'd like to say a few words.
There is no doubt that human illnesses come either on account of an excess in the body or a deficiency, or on account of some damage or deterioration which it suffers from whatever cause there may be.
All right, so let's make sure we have our basic understanding of ancient medicine. This is the foundation of medicine from the Greeks all the way through to the Middle Ages, and really very, very recently because it overturned, with the idea that the body is a perfect working machine. There's forces within it, that's humors and all these other good things that need to be in perfect balance. That doesn't mean like good sense of humor. It's like your liquids, your biles and your blood and all these different things. And this is where people got the notion of bloodletting, because you might have too much blood and so you let a little off because it's excess, and then you'll be back in balance and then you'll be healthy again. So that's the basic notion that he's dealing with, which is the only reason a person gets sick is because something in the body is damaged or out of balance. And if everything was running perfect and in perfect balance, all the different organs and liquids and everything, you wouldn't get sick. That's the assumption.
For in truth, As long as its nature is straight to the utmost degree, and it has not suffered any sort of damage, the body will not sicken.
All right, so that's the basic idea here. If you keep everything in balance, you will be healthy.
But the sin of people will lead them to have an excess or a lack in what is needed for their nature, and they will fall ill.
Okay, so what sets off the balance? What's that?
Sin.
Sin. How? What is the mechanism? Right? When I sin, therefore I'm out of balance, because what happens in between?
Abused your body in some way.
Okay, so it seems in many cases that what he's describing here, and this is in more of his writings in other parts of the book, that he's talking about a direct result of your sin, right? If you eat something that is treif, which he mentions in the next paragraph, that will upset the balance of your body. And once you've upset the balance of your body, then you are more susceptible to illness and sickness and other forms of problems. Or if you are running around and committing licentious deeds with people of questionable character, meaning not your spouse, then you will likely set off the balance of your body. And then they believe that lust was a balance that could get over wrought, and that will trigger reactions. Nowadays, we might call those things STDs. But this is kind of what he's talking. If you are prone to gluttony, if you are prone to excessive asceticism, of self-abuse, and of fasting yourself into disbalance or unbalance, then you will also get sick. So he seems to be describing an almost mechanistic causality, that when you transgress, when you go against what God has commanded, you will trigger within yourself bodily reactions that will lead to its manifestation physically in forms of illness. All right, now he's not saying, let's make sure this is clear, he's not saying that every form of illness is caused by sin. He's saying that sin can lead to illness. Those are two very important and different statements, right? Because damage can also cause your body to be out of whack, right? Someone hits you in the head with a stick, and that knocks you out of balance, quite literally, as well as more deeply physically, and you are going to suffer from it. But what he is positing here, and not universally accepted, but what he is positing here is that if you willingly throw your body out of whack by committing transgressions, then you shouldn't be surprised if your body suffers some of those consequences. So you can't look at somebody and say he's sick because he's a sinner, but you can look at yourself and say, if I sin, I'm going to suffer the consequences. That's his theory. Everyone got the distinction? Right? Because I don't want anyone walking out of here thinking that everybody who's sick is a sinner. Because that's not what he's saying, and that's certainly not what I'm saying. Okay.
We stated earlier at the injunction about the treifa and about forbidden foods that God, blessed is he, removed his people whom he chose from all the things that harm the body, because it is an instrument for the soul that knows its maker.
Right, so God wanted the soul to have a good house, and so he gave us good instructions about how to take care of our body. In particular, he's referring to the laws of kashrut, which came in last week's Torah portion. And he's saying God talked about all of those things, not just because God had a thing about pigs or not pigs, but because this would help keep our bodies in perfect working order so that it can be a good house for the soul. That's what he's saying so far.
Similarly, he removed us from a woman who gave birth, as well as from one unclean on account of the menses, and one who has a discharge for a few days, until they are cleansed of that excess which is in them, which is a bad thing and causes illness. As we said, every excess is a root cause of illness. For this reason, our sages of blessed memory said that no woman sees blood without her head and limbs being heavy on her. Then, without any doubt, in that excess lies illness for them and for anyone who comes at all close to them, and all the more certainly in conjugal intimacy, which is the utmost kind of physical proximity. The child, too, formed while this excess dominates them, is prone to many ills.
All right, so this pre-modern medicine analysis, what is he saying is the reason why you would want to have a separation with the husband and the wife during either post-childbirth or during the menses, or during an abnormal, an irregular discharge of blood? What's the medical theory that's here?
Well, this excess of blood that she has is now an excess liquid.
Mhm.
And when she has this excess blood, she's miserable too and not well.
You can tell that she's ill
Yes.
because she's not feeling great
Right.
while this is all going on. And therefore, you, the husband, who was his primary audience, you don't want to catch it. Right? This is an excess that's causing her discomfort and distress. And therefore, you would want to keep your distance from it purely as a health precaution. And we shouldn't be surprised, says the author, that God would tell us to keep our distance any more than God would tell us not to stick our hand in the mouth of a lion. Right? It's a health regulation that he's describing here. All right.
And by the way,
Yeah.
now that she has this illness and the husband is going to catch it, the child that they make during this time is also going to be susceptible to many illnesses.
So he has this very interesting little explanation tagged on here at the end of why is it that kids get so sick, right? I mean, think about it. Pre-modern time, before you have germ theory, before you understand about vaccinations and about hygiene and all sorts of immunity issues, his explanation for why kids get sick is because kids have spent 9 months being surrounded by this excess of blood, which was not in and of itself bad, but the excess is bad. And therefore, it's not surprising that until the kid has worked that out of their system, they are going to be more prone to illnesses.
So even if you want to approach your wife,
Mhm.
the child will suffer. So maybe that'll be a second reason to keep away, even if you're feeling strongly, I got to do this. But the child will suffer, and I will have a sick kid.
Well, you're saying the kid is already prone to illness from the moment of birth, right? The child was conceived during this time, was raised within her during this excess period, which was what pregnancy was considered in his day.
Oh.
And therefore, when the child comes out, the reason why so many children die in their first month, which was the norm back then, I mean, for so many children to pass when they were born, was because the child was coming out already burdened by this excess from the way that it was being gestated. And therefore, you shouldn't be surprised that it comes out sickly and prone to so many sicknesses. This is his, and it's not his original, this is the medieval immunology understanding of why things worked out the way they worked out. Is this medically sound?
I thought we were never supposed to consider the Torah as a medical manual or, kashrut for health purposes, that it's all ritual.
Right. So there are many sages that say exactly as you just said, Michael, which is that God did not tell us to keep kosher to keep healthy. And God did not tell us to keep away from the period of Nida to keep healthy. But I would be disingenuous if I were to say no one in our tradition retroactively projected their medical understanding into the Torah as a possible reason for why God gave us certain commandments that do not have explicit explanations in and of themselves within the Torah. Because remember, the whole problem and the reason why there's room for him to inject this explanation is because even though we're told there's a difference between boys and girls, and even though we're told there's a separation period at all, we're not told in the Torah why. And so he's trying to come up with some explanation for why there should be a separation at all. And then in a minute, why there should be a separation between men and women differently, depending upon the gender of the child. And he's trying to explain that with the science of his day. Now, the science of his day is wrong. And I have no problem going on record saying that he got the science wrong. Because there is no scientific basis to the notion that there is a problem or with having excess blood, which is what happens during menses or postpartum with the child, or that a child comes out more prone to illness because it's been surrounded within the excess of liquid or bloods within the womb. That there is no scientific basis for that. We have much better, powerful, and predictive and explanatory methods for describing all of the phenomenon that they were trying to explain, and ways of treating and preventing illnesses and issues that come. So I think our understanding of the mechanisms are better than theirs. But what is striking here, and the reason why I brought this, despite the fact that it's wrong, is that he is trying to use the science of his day to understand the Torah. He may have had faulty science, but think about what he was doing, the process that he was going through. He was saying, why would there be a difference? Sorry, that's the next paragraph, but why is there a separation at all? And he's going, well, according to science, ... And he's using that to then understand the Torah better. And the fact that he's wrong, well, that's why we have more than one commentator and lots of debate and discussion, and we don't take any one text as being the definitive one, except for the Torah itself. But the fact that he would even be willing to think to use the science of his day to better understand what was in the Torah is an amazing statement, and one that I want to highlight, even as we sort of roll our eyes or chuckle or squirm, depending upon our reaction to the details of his understanding. Okay, well, let's move on because we're running out of time, as is usual.
For this root reason that we have stated, because of the excess, the Torah ordained that she should be unclean on account of a boy 7 days and on account of a girl 2 weeks.
All right, so hold on to your hats. This is going to explain why we get the difference in length of time as well.
For past any doubt, the excess substances in a woman who bears a female are greater than in one who bears a male.
All right, so there's more of an excess when it's a girl in the womb than when it's a boy. And here's his explanation for why.
Because the conception of a male indicates a warmth in the woman. As our sages of blessed memory
And by the way, they don't mean warmth here like, you know, touchy-feely, warm and cuddly warmth. They mean a physical warmth.
Oh, okay. If the woman completes her share in the conception first, she gives birth to a boy. Now,
Let's make sure we understand that phrase. So for those of you with young children, you may want to turn off the recording at this point. The sages seem to be implying, this is from the Talmud, that when the woman experiences her highest pleasure during intimacy, the child that is conceived at that moment will be a boy. Whereas if the man experiences his pleasure before hers, then the child that will be conceived will be a girl.
oh, that's nice.
Okay, so the sages posit this as being part of their medical understanding, and it has to do with their notion that the way conception worked was the man had the seed and the woman was the field, and depending upon the conditions of the field would determine how the seed would grow, and that the field was conditioned based upon the act of intimacy. And so if intimacy was done in one way, the field would yield a boy from that seed, and if the intimacy was done another way, the field would yield a girl.
That's so nice, because what it says is, since he might really want a boy to carry on his name, make sure your wife is satisfied first.
There does seem to be a practical implication that if we were to assume that in the ancient world, the average man wanted a boy more than a girl, which does seem to have been common among many ancient men, even if the Torah doesn't give a preference, certainly many ancient men did, then yes, if that was your hypothesis, you would be encouraged to ensure her pleasure came before your own, for your own wishes, because long-term you'll get a boy out of it.
Whereas they weren't considering the woman at all. They'd say, if you want a boy, you go first. Right, and never mind what your wife thinks.
Right.
But it
Has
has
nothing to
nice.
do with ovulation then?
No,
No.
according to their understanding of the science of the day. Now, again, we have to say that the science of the days of the Talmud was a little bit inaccurate in this. They had no idea about DNA, they had no idea about genes, and no idea about half the material in an egg and half the material in in the sperm, and the combining for the formation of the embryo. They did not know any of that. They, as far as they could tell, the woman was the earth and the man was the seed, because they did not see any contribution from the physical side of a woman. What they saw monthly was that the field was being cleared and that a new field was being prepared. And that's, the whole redness all comes back to this notion of earth. It even works better as a play on words in Hebrew, where you have dam and adam and adama, all these words that have to do with the land and humanity and blood and redness. The whole metaphor worked really well for them. It's just the science was wrong. But that's what they were working with. And the idea here is that, therefore, if the woman is warmed through the act of intimacy, in quotes, then she is more likely to therefore produce less excess fluids, and therefore a boy only needs 7 days. Right? So again, it's not saying that boys are better and so they only need half as long. He's trying to say scientifically, boys don't get as much of this excess because less excess is produced when a boy is produced because the woman's humors have been warmed in a certain way that prevents the excess. Because he's going to make a distinction between warm and cold as how much excess happens and what happens with the course of other imbalances.
Now, it is known that when an illness is with temperature, its excess substances are few, and it always hastens its activity. This is something logical, understandable.
All right, so again, put aside what you know about modern science. Think about somebody with a fever versus somebody who is also ill but doesn't have a fever, right? Which person seems to have an excess of fluids? The guy without the fever, right? The guy who has pneumonia, right? And their lungs are filling up with fluids and liquids and all of that, whereas the person who's suffering with this boiling fever is dry and parched. They're definitely less moist. And if what we're dealing with here is an excess of liquid, the less moist, that is to say, the warmer you are, the less moist you're going to be. Therefore, the less that has to be purged during this purification process.
So hence, for the conception of a male, a cleansing period of 7 days is enough for us. However, the conception of a female indicates coldness in the woman's physical nature, and in coldness, the excess substances increase.
Again, we're not talking about coldness in any sort of idiom for being frigid or unwarm or unloving. We're talking about a literal coldness in their biological understanding, the science of the day. How are we doing? Right? But again, set aside all of the errors of biology here and notice that he's trying to explain the difference in the purification process between whether it was a boy born or a girl born, not by evaluating the goodness or badness of either gender, but simply by trying to do what he thinks is a scientific analysis of what is true about the fluids and the form that both genders take and the conditions in which they were conceived, etc. He's not saying God approves of boys and therefore it's faster, or saying that God approves of girls, therefore they get more. He's just saying that's the way bodies work. It's a physical thing. And we shouldn't be surprised, he says, that God gave us something that fits the physical thing. But again, he's not trying to introduce a spiritual valuation. He's trying to do a physical analysis.
Quite like this as well is the theme of the menstruant and a woman with a discharge.
Right, so this is Zava, right? So this is the normal monthly cycle or the abnormal signs of blood that are not during the time you would expect the monthly cycle. Those are the two categories we have here.
For the menstruant becomes ritually pure in 7 days, even if she experiences a flow all 7, provided it stops on the 7th while it is yet daytime.
Mm-hmm.
This is by the law of the Torah.
All right, so just a quick pause here, as quick as I can make it. The laws of Nida, that is to say the laws of the monthly cycle, state quite clearly in the Torah that if a woman shows signs of bleeding for 7 days, but it's during the regular period that she would expect to see the bleeding, it's definitely during the menses period, that as long as it stops before the 7th day is over, on the 8th day after immersion, after mikvah, she is perfectly fine to her husband. That is not the way the laws of separation between husband and wife are currently practiced. Right? And there's a reason for that, which we'll get after we describe the next case.
A woman with a discharge, however, requires 7 clean days, but the discharge indicates a large excess of substances in the woman.
Right? So according to him, when you have a Zava, you have a woman who has discharged, and it can be a man as well, but he's just focusing on the feminine because we're talking about childbirth as well. That when a woman has a discharge in a non-predicted time, this is not her lunar quarter, right? But it's just happening at some random day during the month, that shows an additional excess that was not supposed to be there. And therefore, you have to count 7 non-discharging days, 7 clean days, before you can immerse and resume intimacy with your spouse. Everyone following that? Right? So what you've ended up with in the classical period and now on to the modern period is that most, really all of our traditional communities for the last 2,000 years took the stringency of an abnormal discharge and have applied it to the regular monthly cycle. So that the way most people keep the laws of Nida, of separation during the monthly cycle, is to wait until they stop showing any discharge, and then count 7 clean days, and then immerse. As opposed to the way the Torah describes it, which is 7 days, as long as it's your monthly time, you can be bleeding right up till the end. And as long as you're done, 8th day after mikvah, you're fine. And that's a stringency, according to the Talmud, that the daughters of Israel took upon themselves to have that longer period than what the Torah actually demands. And that's a whole other class that we're not going to go into. But just in case you are trying to reconcile what you have heard about the laws of separation, which in most communities end up being almost 2 weeks of separation, with what we've read now in the Torah, which says it's only a week of separation, that's where the discrepancy happened. They are treating it as a abnormal discharge, which is a greater stringency, which creates a greater length of separation.
Now, we could say that the malady of the emission of blood in women every month is in order that they should not become conceited in their frivolousness, or in order to remove their proximity somewhat from the man, so that he should not be pursuing them all the time, for they will become slightly depreciated in his sight on account of that sullying which he knows in regard to them, and he will not be constantly occupied with a love for them.
All right, so very interesting, and I wouldn't necessarily say normative psychological analysis on his part, which I wanted to bring again, just to show that not every statement by every commentator is universally accepted and agreed upon by everyone. We'd only have one book. So why might we say that women have been given this monthly cycle? Because it's clearly not that they're becoming sick every month because they've done something wrong, right? Because it happens automatically according to the creation of the species. Why might God have made that part of the process, though, of our species, according to him?
People want what's forbidden to them. So if your wife is forbidden to you for a couple of weeks, you'll keep wanting her more and more. If you can't touch, that's what you want to touch.
Well, actually, the rabbis in the Talmud, in the next paragraph, take your opinion.
Oh, they do. Okay.
His opinion is a slightly inverted vision, which is that if women didn't have this issue, they'd get too full of themselves, right? They would be conceited in their frivolousness. I mean, they would just think the world of themselves. But this knocks them down a peg. And more to the point, and from his perspective, it knocks them down a peg in the eyes of their husband, who will go, women, they're not so great. I mean, look what happens to them every month. So therefore, I don't have to adore them in some obsessive manner, because at least once a month, they are unappealing to me, according to his interpretation here. Again, making sure that everyone knows this is his interpretation. I'm not putting my stamp on this. But it's an important analysis to see how different communities approached, why would this even happen? Right? Why would God have designed the human body to go through this monthly process? And these are the two explanations that he gives, is that it keeps women from thinking too much of themselves, and it keeps men from thinking too much about women. You may not be buying that. I'm not sure I'm buying it either. And Harriet, the explanation you gave is actually found much, much earlier in the Talmud.
Earlier in Talmud, Rabbi Meir used to say, why did the Torah say Nida lasts 7 days? because if he, the husband, would become accustomed to her, his wife, he would loathe her. Therefore, the Torah made her impure for 7 days so that she would be as beloved to her husband as at the moment she entered the chuppah.
Right? Familiarity breeds contempt.
Mhm.
And having at least a week separation as the Torah described, or longer, depending upon how you keep it in the modern custom, means that there will always be a rejuvenation of the desire and attraction and affection between husband and wife, that they can come back as though they were newlyweds, that they just were under the chuppah once again. And that's a much more positive way of looking at it, as saying that it's not that it is an excess or that there is a problem or that this is meant to knock anyone down a peg. It's meant to rejuvenate the relationship between husband and wife, and the only way that can happen would be by enforcing a separation, and the only way you can enforce a separation is to make it a commandment. Because if you just tell people, you should take a week off every month,
Right.
we all know how many people are going to actually take off anytime every month. Okay, any questions? Okay, we're going to resume our Sefer HaChinuch here, because he comes to a conclusion which hopefully will remove some of the displeasure with certain of his analyses.
About this, the sages of blessed memory said that it is one fountain, but the Torah declared it defiled, and the Torah declared it ritually clean.
All right, let's make sure we understand what he's talking about here. Remember I said way back when we began an hour ago that we've got 7 days where, for both holy things as well as for the husband, the woman is not allowed, right? No contact. And then we've got 33 or 66 where, yes, she still doesn't go to the temple precincts or anything, but for the husband, it's okay, even if there is a discharge of blood during this period, right? And he's saying, how hard to understand is that? Because the blood that might come out down here during the 33 days is coming from the exact same place that any discharge came during pregnancy or during the delivery or during the 7-day period. And it's coming from the same place that it comes during the monthly cycle. And it's coming from the same place as it comes when there is an abnormal discharge of blood. And yet those are something that renders ritually impure. And these discharges don't make something ritually impure, even though it's the same source, the same blood. That's just so unusual. How do we get our head around that? If there was one organ that put out certain blood at some times, and the blood from that organ was ritually impure, and another organ that put out blood at other times, and from that organ it was ritually okay, that would make perfect sense. But he's saying, no, our sages knew and understood that this is all from the same place, all from the womb. So how do we reconcile the fact that the Torah says that blood's okay and that blood isn't?
In other words, the blood of birth, which the Torah declared ritually unclean, and the blood of purity, which the
That's
Torah ruled ritually clean,
33-day period.
are from one place. It is only that the Torah would make the matter depend on the time, declaring the blood that issues from it at one time ritually unclean, and the second time ritually clean. Then, blessed is he who knows all wisdom, that he did all with a right and essential reason. He knew that until such time the blood is harmful, and from then on it is not harmful.
Okay, so his final analysis, I still disagree with that last sentence. He knew that the blood from here would be bad and the blood from here would be okay. But the bigger notion that he's introducing here, which is that we don't know why this is, that he is retroactively projecting an analysis into this based on his own scientific understanding. But ultimately, the only reason why this is the way it is because the one who created the universe told us this is the way it should be. And we can try to retroactively assume that it's because of health reasons, which is what he's doing, or we can be like many other sages, which reject this whole health reason and say, no, it's not about that at all. It is about the time. It is about that which is intangible that is important. Or others that say it's not about time or about the material, it's simply about the command, that there should be a discipline. Or others who take a psychological route and say it's not about the command in particular, although it's always about the command to some degree, and it's not about the time, and it's not about the harmful effects. It's about the relationship and the psychology of the woman, of how is she recovering between the birth of these children, how is she going to recover her intimacy with her husband, what's happening in her and her community, and the Brit Milah and all the other psychological and social effects. We can try to analyze it from all those things using the tools of the rest of the Torah, the rest of our tradition. But that's our job. And also to know that we'll never be 100% sure that we were 100% right. Right? We'll do our best, and we'll argue about it, and we'll discuss it, and we'll learn it. And if we try to use the science of our day to understand it, that's okay. But we also have to recognize that just like this, the science of our day, when we try to understand certain things, may eventually be overturned. That doesn't mean the commandment is overturned. It means our analysis has to be reviewed and has to be looked at again more deeply. So that's what I'll leave you with as your thought for the day of what do we think we understand, and how prepared are we to re-examine it if we find information that contradicts it? And how much of an allegiance will we show to the underlying command, even when we're not 100% sure why it is the way it is?
I'm not sure why it is the way it is. but
Welcome to the
today,
club.
when we're talking about childbirth and things which I have not talked about or thought about in a very long time, randomly, I have a book that's dedicated to the memory of my husband.
Oh.
Out of all
Nothing.
the
So
out of
we
all the
have- we
Humashim
have
on the
mysteries.
shelves,
We have mysteries.
Mysteries.
Oh.
we have mysteries within mysteries.
Yeah.
Well, it's a good memory to be reminded of. Very good. Thank you for giving us to finish that on.
And it's also like, just because I said so.
Well, there's always the because I said so, but we want to understand more. And as long as we don't reject the said so because we don't understand, we're doing okay.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. We've got to once again take